Welcome to Hidden Hilltop Homestead. In today's episode, I'm going to be showing you how to make this gorgeous American flag rag quilt. The finished size is 75 by 65 inches. We have this laid out on a California king bed. It is red, blue, and white on the front, and then a cream flannel on the back. And I've used all different colored squares to create a very rustic look. So let's go ahead and get into it. So I'm going to be giving you a lot of numbers here, but I will put everything down in the description box so that you have all of the materials listed for this project. So we are going to need to make 49 blue squares, 77 red squares, 69 white squares, and then we're going to need 195 squares for the back of the blanket and for the batting, which goes in the middle. So I'm going to be cutting a variety of blue squares, white squares, and red, meaning that I'm going to have at least 5 patterns in my total amount. So I'm basically using this project as a way to clean out the stash of fabric that I have. You're going to need 5 yards for your flannel. I'm using a 44-inch width from Hobby Lobby for this. And I'm going to be using the Warm and Natural batting. This is also by the yard at Hobby Lobby. You could also buy this pre-packaged in a queen or full size set. Now for the blue, I need 1.5 yards. For the red, I use 2.5 yards. And for the white, I use 2 yards. And again, I split that up into several different designs. The only tools you're really going to need for this project are going to be your sewing machine. You just need to do generic straight stitches, and then I have these 6-inch and 5-inch squares to cut out all of my fabric pieces. I use, of course, the 6-inch for the front and the back, and then the 5-inch is for the batting squares. I use a rotary cutter on a self-healing mat to cut all of my squares. It just makes it easier. So I'm going to go ahead and show you really quick how I assemble my squares. I take a piece of my flannel and then I put my batting in the middle. I try to center it as best to my ability, and then I will put the top fabric right on top of that, line it up with the bottom piece. And then I'm putting 2 pins in this. You could totally do 4. You could use quilt clips, do whatever you like. This is what I feel comfortable using to hold my squares together. And I'm just going to make sure I'm getting through the batting and the front and back fabric. Super simple. So this is how I build my square sandwiches, I call them, to put aside, and we'll be quilting these later, and then of course building the blanket. So you're going to do this with every piece that you have, and then we're going to be sewing an X through the middle, which again I'll show you later. So we're just going to do this 195 times. Now I'm going to show you how I sew the X through my block. We're literally just doing a straight diagonal line, creating an X right through the middle of the block. Super simple. This is the only actual quilting we're going to be doing for this rag quilt. So I have my sewing machine. I center my sewing needle in the middle of my foot. I'm just using the generic stitch that is on there when you start the machine. I do 2 stitches, I do 2 back stitches, and then I just do my straight line, clear across, and when I get to the end, I do 2 back stitches and 2 front stitches. I'm starting and stopping my stitches about 1/4 inch away from the edge of the fabric. And I'm actually going to show you my method for saving thread. Instead of taking my square off, I'm going to go ahead and add another square onto this and just keep sewing. I have maybe like 1 inch of thread pulled out from the end of my last square, and I'm just starting another stitch doing the same thing, and I'm going to do this with maybe like 10 to 15 pieces at a time, and this saves so much thread as opposed to pulling your pieces out, cutting the edge, and going from there. I like to do this in a batch work. It's time saving, material saving. It's wonderful. So yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and sew about 10 pieces, same as I did the first one, just our straight line. So after I have sewn a few blocks, I will come back through and separate the blocks. just like this. And as you can see, there's not a lot of leftover thread in the corners. So now we're just going to go back through. This is an example of once you've done all of your blocks, one diagonal line, you're going to go back through and you're just going to sew the other side of the square, and you're going to do the same exact thing as you did the first time. We're just doing a straight line all the way diagonally across the square, starting and ending with a back stitch to ensure that our stitch is secure. And then I just raise the needle, pick up the foot, and pull the project out maybe an inch, and then I move on to the next square. So once you're done quilting your X's in every square, you're going to have a pile that looks a little something like this. We have all the white, blue, and red ready to roll. Again, we have 69 white, 77 red, and 49 blue. So now we're going to lay out our design, and I have a 15 by 13 quilt here. So we're doing 7 squares of blue, and then we'll have 8 squares of red for row 1, row 2, 7 blue, 8 white, and then that'll go clear down halfway down the blanket, and then we'll be doing 15 white, 15 red for the remainder of the blanket, beginning and ending with red stripes, because this is going to be as close to the American flag as we can make it. So I'm going to go ahead and lay out my squares. Now I am doing this in a very compressed fashion because I have a small table to work with. If you have room to lay this out on the floor or on a bed so that you can get a full look of how your blanket's going to look, that is the best option. Again, I've done several of these blankets. This is just how I like to lay my stuff out, so it's going to be very compact. But basically I'm going to be separating all of my squares into designs, and then I'm going to be building the quilt alternating the designs because we're looking for like a rustic look, which I will show you here in just a minute. I don't have a pattern here, so I'm just going to lay my squares out until I'm happy with how they look. Now this is a very customizable blanket, so you could do solid blue squares, you could do different blue squares that don't have stars, you could do only stars. I have 4 different designs here. One's like a dark navy with like a cream colored star, and then I have like a paisley just blue. I have a blue with like little white plus signs on them, and then I have a blue with more saturated stars. My only goal with this is to make sure that I don't have any of the same patterns touching side to side. Now they can be like diagonal from each other, that's fine. I just don't want them touching because I don't want a glob of the same design in one section of the blue. This is a little bit of a close-up of all of the different prints I have, but I only have 4 different designs. You could do more, you could do less, truly up to you. That's what's great about this blanket. It's very customizable. It's a great stash buster. So I'm just going to go ahead and lay out 7 blocks of blue, and then I'm going to move on to my red, and I'm going to be doing 8 blocks of red. So this is my first row. I have 7 blue, 8 red. I'm going to be alternating rows of 7 blue, 8 white, and 7 blue, 8 red down until I get to row 7, and then 8 to 13 is going to be solid white and solid red. So I'm going to bring you back here when I've finished. So we have all the squares laid out. We are 15 wide by 13 vertical. We are starting with red, ending with red. All the blue looks good. All the white and the red looks good. I've moved a few things around. It took me a little bit to get everything the way I wanted it to make sure I had enough alternating designs. So now I'm going to stack my rows and get them ready to be sewn together. So I'm starting with the last square of the last row, and I'm just stacking them on top of each other backwards because that's going to give me a pile that I can start sewing together in the correct order. And I have row markers for my quilts just because I make so many of them. You could use a piece of paper, write down what row it is. Mine are made out of foam, like craft foam with a Sharpie number written on them, and then I just stick a pin through it, and that makes my pile. I only go up to 12 though because that's my normal size, so my last row isn't going to be marked, but I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm going to take every row, last block on the bottom, first block on the top, so that like when you start pulling the squares off of the pile, you're in the order it needs to be. And I'm going to get all of these stacked up and get ready to start sewing the blocks together to create my rows. Keeping your rows organized is super important. That way you're not sewing the wrong blocks together. It really stinks when you're halfway through a row and you realize you left out a block or you sewed them out of order, and then you have to start taking the blanket apart. So it's much more convenient to just build these piles and get everything situated so that you're ready to go whenever you start sewing. Now this is going to be my first row here that I'm putting together, and I'm going to show you here in a minute how we join these squares, but I did want to give an example of what my row blockers look like. They're just a little piece of foam and I stick a pin in it, and there you go, row 1. So let's move on and start sewing this together. So the assembly part is super simple. We're doing a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and all you're going to do is stick your first block and your second block back to back, and you're going to sew a straight line. Make sure they're lined up. I don't pin my squares because I do this so much, I'm used to it, but you can definitely pin it to make sure that you are perfectly aligned. The more aligned you are, the easier the quilt comes together, and it's easier to keep your rows straight. So I'm just using the first generic stitch that pops on my sewing machine. I have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm doing a back stitch at the beginning and a back stitch at the end, just like when you were sewing your X's and doing the quilting. Only this time I'm taking off each square, and it's going to look something like this. So that's my first square, second square. You're just sewing them together and you're keeping the raw edges on the front of the blanket. I'm going to trim all of my thread, and then I'm going to cut the fringe as I go. Super simple. Cutting this fringe is what gives it the rag effect after being washed, and I am doing somewhere between like a 1/4 inch and a 1/2 inch space between each snip. I don't measure it exactly, I just kind of go through it and make it look how I like. I keep about a 1/2 inch away from the edge of the fabric though, so that when I start building my rows I have less trouble with getting everything to lay flat. So that's my first 2 squares. I'm literally going to do the same thing for the rest of it, and we're going to build the rest of our row. Trim the fringe as you go, and then we're going to work on row number 2, and I'm going to show you how to add this together. So row 1, row 2. And we're doing essentially the same thing with our rows as we did with our blocks. You're just going to put them backs together, line them up, make sure your seams are as even as you possibly can, and you're just sewing a straight line all the way down. So to get this as best as I can flat, I just pull the edges and sandwich it just like that, and then I'm going to sew straight across it. And that's going to give us a really nice corner seam. For every seam we're doing the same thing. We're just separating the squares, and you're just going to have, we're sewing right across the flannel, which is what's on technically the back of the blanket. Sewing straight across. So you can do whatever you need, pin it, use clips. I don't pin it because, again, I do this so much. You could even iron this if you need to get your seams to lay flat. Whatever you need to do to make yourself comfortable with how you're sewing this, do what you gotta do. So I'm going to go ahead, and it's the same exact thing. I'm doing a 1/2 inch seam allowance, starting with a back stitch, ending with a back stitch, and then as I go, I'm going to flatten out the seams and then sew right over top of them. So I keep my rows in a roll. This just makes it really easy to like unroll it as I go, and then I'll also roll it up behind the machine as I'm progressing through the blanket. As you add rows, you're gonna get a lot bulkier, so it's nice to keep everything as neat and tidy as you can whenever you're sewing. It just makes it easier for manipulating the blanket around. So when I get to my seam, I just separate it and push it down. You're going to do that on the front and the back because you're doing the same thing, front and back. And then I'm just going to sew straight across and just keep on going. I'm constantly checking to make sure that everything's lined up, my edges are good, my seams are good, and you're just going to keep that even and keep doing a straight line all the way to the end. Once you have sewn your 2 rows together, it's going to look like this. So we have 2 rows. That's the top row, row 1, row 2. We're going to trim the fringe on this the same way we did this. We're doing about 1/4 to 1/2 inch snips, and then I'm also going to trim off the thread on the end to try to keep everything neat as I go. Now once I get to a seam intersection, I'm going to show you really quick what I do there. I just cut inside of the 2 folds. I'm just trimming a straight line right where those 2 seams meet up. I'm not trying to separate anything, like I'm not cutting anything off, I'm just trying to keep fringe. And I just cut as close as I can to that seam intersection without actually cutting any thread. Very easy. Again, that just gives you a really nice fringe in your intersections. I'm going to show you again here real quick. You're just going right in between the 2 folds. And just snip. Super simple, super easy. I'm going to do that all the way down the row, just like we did in between the individual squares, and we're just going to keep repeating this throughout our entire blanket. So this is what 1 through 7 are looking like, rows 1 through 7. And I'm going to be doing this in 2 halves. So I'm going to stop here and then I'm going to start building the other half of the blanket and then join them together once I have the bottom solid rows done. Alright, so we have rows 8 through 13 over here. This is 1 through 7. I just split it in half and did 2 halves to make it easier so it's not as bulky trying to run it all through the sewing machine. So now I'm going to put them together. I'm literally just combining them as you would putting the rows together. It's just now I have like a whole half of a blanket to sew to the other half of the blanket. So I'm going to get that put together and then I'm going to show you what it looks like when it's done. So this is a big blanket and I'm kind of struggling because it's so big, but we have all the rows sewed together. Yay! So now we're going to do the trim work, which I'm going to show you. It's very, very simple. So essentially what we're doing is creating a fringe all around the edge of the blanket, and this is locking in the raw edge so that it doesn't unravel to nothing. So we're doing the same, essentially same thing as what we were doing when we were sewing our blocks together. We're doing a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm starting at the very corner of, or one of the corners of the blanket, and I do a couple stitches and then I do a couple back stitches, and then I am just sewing straight all along the edge of the blanket, and we're just essentially binding the front to the back around the outside edge of the blanket. So when I get to a seam, I'm doing the same thing I did previously. I'm just splitting the seam in half, laying it flat, sewing straight over top of it, and I'm going to do that all the way to the edge of each corner, and I'm going to show you how I turn the corners. So I'm coming to the corner. I'm going to get about a 1/2 inch from the end of the corner, and then I'm going to stop and I'm going to do a couple back stitches and then a couple front stitches back to where I stopped, leaving the needle in. I'm going to raise the foot, rotate the blanket around the corner. I'm going to do a couple front stitches, do a couple back stitches, and then continue on and do the same exact thing all the way around until I get back to where I started. Now that I'm back to my starting point, I have completely sewn a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around the outside of my quilt. I'm going to trim the fringe around the outside of the quilt the same exact way as I did the others. This is also going to be a good time to trim off all the extra thread that I come across. This is just the thread from my starting and finishing on the trim seam. And for the corners, I just cut them out just like that. I'm going to do that on all 4 corners, and then the same spacing, 1/4 to 1/2 inch all the way around. Same thing whenever I get to a seam, I'm just going inside of that fold over spot and just cutting straight like that. Yep, same thing all the way around the blanket, and then we'll be done with the trim. Once the trim is done, we are ready to wash the quilt. So I'm going to take this entire thing. I have 5 or 6 of these color catchers. They are shout / generic color catchers. You're going to need these definitely no matter what colors you have on your quilt. I always use it. I always pre-wash my quilting fabric, and I still use color catcher because there is always color bleeding. So I'm going to take this whole thing, I'm going to put it in the washer. I'm washing it on cold. I'm doing just a generic cycle. I'm not doing any pre-soak. I'm not doing extra rinse or anything. We're just doing a quick generic cycle. I do like a scoop of powdered laundry detergent and a splash of vinegar because that's what I use for fabric softener. And as soon as it's done, we're going to get it out and put it in the dryer, and we're going to completely dry it. You want it to not be wet. You want it completely dried. The drying is what's going to really bring the fringe to life. So I'm going to toss the cat off of here, and then I'm going to get this in the washer, and we're going to show you what it looks like when it comes out after we have everything done. So this is what we're left with, our beautiful quilt. Now I have this laid out on a California king size bed, so it looks a little like wonky, but it's beautiful. The fringe looks wonderful. I did not have any type of color bleeding. Thank you, color catchers. The back looks great. After it's been washed and dried, it really it just brings the quilt to life. And the more you wash and dry these quilts, the more it's going to fringe, the more fuzzy the fringe is going to get. So it's going to become even more beautiful. I think this really just is an awesome beginner project. Just make sure you have your lint roller handy because you're going to need it. And I'm actually going to fold this up and put it into storage because I'm going to list this one for sale on my Facebook page. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching the tutorial, and we'll catch you next time.